The North won the war. Its troops occupied the defeated South for another 12 years, until 1877, the end of our class and the end of Reconstruction. We call this period Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, as it was an attempt to reconstruct the warring sections into one nation. In this lecture, I'm arguing that the Republican Party, almost synonymous with the Union and the victorious North, had too many goals to accomplish any one of them. Victorians wanted first to stay in political power, and second, to remake society on a free labor model, to replace slavery with its own economic system, and to develop the West along the same lines. Finally, they wanted to regain export markets for cotton and their contribution to national income. This was a lot to try to accomplish while keeping the peace in the rebel territories. Actually, Reconstruction began before the war was over, as the Confederacy shrank and the Union began to win battles and encroach into the CSA. It experimented with what occupation might look like. On Port Royal, an island in the Port Royal Sound of South Carolina, in 1861, planters ran off and abandoned their plantations, and the 10,000 slaves they left behind divided up the land into parcels, and each began to cultivate it on his own. When the Union Army arrived, it sent back a report that these abandoned slaves wished to work the land as free men and women, so the government helped. A northern force of abolitionists, doctors, and missionaries arrived on the cotton plantation and set up schools and managed the plantation's relationship with cotton merchants. The goal was to regain cotton production levels from before the war, to prove that free labor could do the same work that slaves had done. Also, some of the Port Royal freedmen volunteered for service in the Union Army and became the first South Carolina Volunteer Regiment, who acquitted themselves admirably in the war. At the end of the conflict, the land was expected to be redistributed in 40-acre plots to the freed people who worked it. But when President Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson ascended to the presidency, he began a policy we now call presidential Reconstruction. Remember, he was a Tennessee senator who stayed loyal to the United States, the only senator from the Confederate States who did so. Lincoln chose him as the running mate to help balance the ticket, so to help gain votes from the Midwestern Democrats who wanted peace and just might vote for McClellan. When Lincoln died in mid-April 1865, President Johnson began issuing personal pardons to some 13,000 Confederate plantation masters. His plan gave the Port Royal land back to its old owners, for example, as long as they paid their back taxes and took an oath of loyalty to the United States. There would be no land redistribution, nor any real punishment. Southerners settled quickly into a system of sharecropping, in which freed people worked to grow a crop, and then in return they were paid in a share of the crop. And when the rebels began returning to their plantations and trying to return to cotton production with their former slaves, they used the rapidly developing system of sharecropping to get back to production. They also returned to Congress to take their old seats in the government. The rebels who received pardons from Johnson and expected to just take back their seats in the U.S. Congress included Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the CSA, and the author of the first document we read in this class, the Cornerstone Speech from 1861. Also, lots of high-up military heroes of the war, including Confederate generals and colonels, men who had directed military battles against the United States. Traitors, in my view. These men returned to Congress in December 1865, just 8 months after the Confederate surrender and the assassination of Lincoln. The Congress to which they returned was filled with Republicans who had fought these rebels for 4 years. Conflict was brewing. At the same time, in these first months after the official surrender, Southern legislatures rapidly began passing black codes, attempting to restrict the movements of the emancipated slaves, the freed people. They wanted to stop people from renting farms so they could have more control of the work people did and where they lived. They outlawed unapproved movements, leaving your farm at night to go to a dance, or hang out at a friend's house, or go to a political meeting, because these were the things free people do, and tried to do. The black codes prevented blacks from voting, or serving on juries. All these things combined to restrict not only the personal freedmen of the freed people, but also their political activity. Remember that the Republicans were trying to stay in political power, as the old Southern states were being admitted back into the Union, and the Republicans were the Black Republicans, the party of Lincoln, anathema to the Confederates, and vice versa. They needed the black vote to stay in power, but they also needed cotton, and the one-time planters returning to their land were in a position to supply it. That was December of 1865. And after the winter recess, in February 1866, President Johnson vetoed a law that Congress had passed, a law to extend the charter of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau had been formed in 1865 to try to keep the peace, and part of this was the need to adjudicate the relationship between planters and their one-time slaves. Part of what the Freedmen's Bureau did was to set up courts of law, where contracts could be enforced. As sharecropping had created contracts between landlords and sharecroppers, the Freedmen's Bureau helped make sure those contracts were enforced and its provisions made clear. There was a lot of conflict over these contracts. People who had once owned slaves wanted their workers to behave as they had always done, but the new contracts and the new free labor system was built on a different structure. For example, if the worker had contracted to grow a crop of cotton, and in exchange he got a share of that crop, then who should pay to mend fences? Generally, it's not the job of the tenant to fix stuff or improve the property. That's the job of the landlord, because the improvement or repair outlasts the individual tenant. But this was not something planters were used to, and they were used to using violence to enforce their power. The state-level black codes tried to limit the freedom of the freed people, while the Federal Freedmen's Bureau tried to enforce it. When Johnson vetoed the extension of the Bureau, Congress passed it over his veto. Then, they passed a Civil Rights Bill in March 1866. The bill spoke to the other theme of this course, the question of who is a person in the eyes of the law, as the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 made free black men citizens of the United States, and forbade the states from the worst of the black codes. Johnson vetoed this one, too. Congress was able to override his veto in both cases, however, enacting the Civil Rights Bill and eventually passing the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, establishing citizenship for all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and establishing federal power over state laws, intending to deprive its citizens of their liberty. The next year came the 15th Amendment, which established the rights of the freed men to vote, only the black men, however. And, for a time, the power of the Republicans in the federal government was supported by the votes of the freed people, and the Freedmen's Bureau occupied the rebellious territories and tried to keep things fair between landlords and former slaves. But this couldn't stay forever. As more Confederates returned to Congress, the patience of the nation for continued intervention wore out. It was 4 years of bloody civil war, followed by 12 more years of occupation, and this sort of cartoon began to take hold, with the Freedmen's Bureau an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, and the clearly racist appeals to end the Northern support for the freed people. Reconstruction ended as a result of the presidential election of 1876. The Republicans, in power since 1860, nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democrats, associated with the defeated South but returned to the halls of government during Reconstruction, nominated Samuel Tilden. You can see that the electoral vote was divided exactly in half. The North was Republican, and the South was Democrat, wherever whites had regained political power enough to keep blacks from the polls. The Democrats had begun to eat their way through the Republican North as well, receiving the votes of New York and the rest of the mid-Atlantic states that did so much business with the Cotton South and in the old Midwest. But the evenly split Electoral College meant that the vote had to be decided some other way. It was time, once again in American history, for some compromise to get the nation functioning again. The Compromise of 1877 is one of those things that happened, but left little documentary record. The result was that Rutherford B. Hayes took the presidency, and in exchange for recognizing and accepting this, the Democrats of the South won some concessions. First, the Freedmen's Bureau and the rest of the federal troops would withdraw from the South. With them went the federal bureaucracy and most white Republicans, leaving the freed people to the mercy of the former planters. Also included in the bargain, probably, was some federal pork barrel spending to help the South regain its economic footing. This included routing a new transcontinental railroad through the South. Remember, from the Transportation Revolution, the building railroads and canals that crossed state lines required federal help. In the case of the transcontinentals, the federal government just gave land to the corporations, which they could use not only to build tracks, but to develop into towns that would use the railroad's services. Or the giant, supposedly privately owned railroad companies could sell these federal gifts for capital to build the road or to water their stock, making the small investments of individual stockholders less valuable. The whole thing was a scheme typical of big government support for big business, so the South and the Republican government both benefited. When federal troops withdrew, of course, the old planters turned landlords set about regaining their power both politically and economically. The goal was white government, and the means were violent. It was in this period that the Ku Klux Klan developed as a secret society organized to bind the labor back onto the land and to limit the political participation of the freed people so as to redeem government back into the control of the Democrat planters who had fought against the United States to maintain their way of life and the basis of their economy. In the spring, when I teach the history of the South since the Civil War, I begin my story with the redemption of the North Carolina government and the race riot in Wilmington in 1898, which not only returned white men to political power by means of a coup d'etat, it also drove African Americans from the community. Historians call the period 1870s to 1900 the first Ku Klux Klan, because there have been so many more across the 20th century. And the Klan was not the only white supremacist organization in 20th century American history, it's just the one we all think is bad. In Wilmington, the paramilitary force was called the Red Shirts, which made them easily recognizable at the polling places, for example. And there was a second iteration of the Klan in the 1920s. Inspired largely by the showing of a 1915 movie that did a lot to create and perpetuate the pro-slavery ideology in a new form. The 20th century version of pro-slavery was known as the Lost Cause, an idealization of the Confederacy, first in Southern public places in the form of Confederate monuments, often placed in front of courthouses just to make sure that everyone understood who the justice system was for. The 1920s Klan was not limited to the South, but was active in cities like Chicago and small towns across Indiana. It was partly a response to the Great Migration and the movement of Southern Americans, many of them African American, into northern cities in pursuit of wartime factory jobs and the freedoms they promised. But that's a story for another day. The movie that inspired the formation of the new Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. It is famous from the silent movie era as a revolution in the art of filmmaking, and it was not only wildly popular. It introduced film conventions like juxtaposition that have become standard methods of cinematic storytelling ever since. President Woodrow Wilson referred to the cinematic masterpiece and the new technology of moving pictures as history written with lightning. The Birth of a Nation was based on a novel called The Klansman, and it told a story of Civil War and Reconstruction that supported the Lost Cause myth and portrayed black male rapists as a threat to decent white middle-class womanhood. It portrayed black male political participation in these racialized terms. Here's a famous clip that captures all that mythology. Here's another clip that expresses white supremacy as a Christian message, with Jesus blessing the redemption of white power, both politically and economically, and socioculturally too. And here is the grim reaping at the end. With Jesus blessing the scene. Lost cause ideology has penetrated through American culture, to the point where some people say the Civil War was about something other than slavery, that slaves were happy and masters were kind. But this is a subject for your next class in American history, and your next professor will pick up the story there. Thank you so much for watching.